In February 1944, American forces attacked a small atoll in the Marshall Islands called Kwajalein with overwhelming firepower and tactical superiority, and they won the battle so completely and so decisively that the operation became a textbook example of successful amphibious warfare taught in military academies for decades. But this narrative ignores a crucial fact that has been lost to popular memory. Kwajalein was the most efficient victory in the Pacific War, a battle where American planning and Japanese overconfidence combined to create conditions for a triumph so clean and so thorough that history forgot it ever happened, because battles that go exactly right never make it into the textbooks the way battles that cost everything do. The Americans had suffered catastrophic casualties just weeks earlier at Tarawa, where nearly 1,000 Marines died in 76 hours against an enemy force of only 4,600 defenders, and military planners had warned that assaulting Kwajalein would require similar sacrifice and similar bloodshed. But what actually happened was something entirely different from what every military expert predicted. But why did Kwajalein become the forgotten victory? Why did American commanders at the time recognize it as a historic triumph, while modern military history barely mentions it? And what made this battle so different from every other island campaign that it somehow managed to combine overwhelming success with complete historical obscurity? The answers to these questions reveal a story of Admiral Chester Nimitz's bold strategic decision to ignore the advice of three of his most experienced commanders, of Japanese generals who made catastrophic mistakes in military judgment, and of how a battle won through superior planning and tactical innovation, rather than through grinding attrition and sacrifice, became invisible to history precisely because it did not conform to the narrative of Pacific combat that Americans had come to expect. In December 1943, in a conference room at Pearl Harbor, Admiral Chester Nimitz sat with three of the most accomplished military officers in the United States Navy and asked them a deceptively simple question about the next target in the American advance across the Pacific, because the war in the Pacific had settled into a strategy of island hopping, where American forces would capture strategic islands one by one, establish air bases, and use those air bases to support the capture of the next island further west toward the eventual invasion of Japan itself. The Central Pacific Campaign had been rolling forward methodically since November 1943, when American forces attacked Tarawa in the Gilbert Islands, and that battle had been a shocking introduction to what Pacific warfare would look like for the next 20 months, because Tarawa was heavily defended by 4,600 Japanese sailors and soldiers under the command of Rear Admiral Shibasaki Keiji, who had prepared the atoll with interlocking fields of fire, coastal defenses, and defensive positions designed to make an amphibious assault as costly as possible. When American Marines waded ashore on Tarawa on November 20th, 1943, they encountered devastating machine gun and artillery fire that cut them down in the water and on the beaches, and the fighting lasted for 3 days of brutal close-quarters combat in confined spaces where the Marines ultimately prevailed, but at a terrible price, with 1,022 Marines killed and 2,101 wounded, a casualty rate that shocked the American public when casualty figures were released, and that convinced military planners that future island assaults would be similarly catastrophic. Now, in December 1943, Nimitz was looking at two possible targets for the next phase of the Central Pacific Campaign: the outer islands of the Marshall Islands Group, which would be easier to assault, but which were further away and required longer supply lines and would take longer to reach the more strategic inner islands, or Kwajalein Atoll itself, which was much deeper in the Marshall Islands, which was heavily fortified and heavily garrisoned and which conventional military doctrine said should only be attacked after the outer islands had been captured and secured. Sitting across from Nimitz were Vice Admiral Raymond Spruance, who had won the Battle of Midway and who was one of the greatest naval commanders alive, Rear Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner, who had coordinated more amphibious landings than any officer in the entire Pacific Theater, and who had personally overseen the Tarawa operation, and Marine General Holland Smith, who had fought at Tarawa just 21 days earlier and who still had the smell of that battle in his clothes and the sight of dead Marines in his eyes. Nimitz asked them directly, should the Navy attack Kwajalein immediately, striking deep into Japanese territory and taking the biggest prize first, or should they follow conventional military wisdom and take the outer islands first, building their strength methodically and working slowly inward, the way every military textbook said a commander should approach a fortified position? Spruance answered first, and he said that attacking Kwajalein immediately was too dangerous, because the atoll was too far from current American positions, because Japanese aircraft from nearby islands could reinforce the defenders, and because if the attack failed, or if American forces suffered heavy casualties, there would be no nearby air bases to provide air support for a retreat or a reinforcement effort. Turner agreed with Spruance, saying that launching an amphibious assault on Kwajalein without first securing the outer islands was reckless from a logistical perspective, because supply lines would be stretched too thin, because wounded would have to be evacuated over long distances without nearby medical facilities, and because if Japanese naval forces appeared, American ships would be too far from friendly air bases to receive adequate air protection. Smith, the Marine general, who had lost hundreds of his men at Tarawa, added his voice to the consensus by saying that assaulting Kwajalein directly would be suicidal, that the outer islands must be taken first to establish air bases and create a secure logistical foundation for any attack deeper into the Marshall Islands, and that the Marines could not afford another Tarawa-style battle with casualty rates measured in the thousands. But Nimitz, who had studied the situation carefully and who had access to intelligence information that suggested the Japanese were expecting the Americans to take the methodical approach and prepare their defenses accordingly, made a decision that would fundamentally change the course of the Pacific War and prove that sometimes the boldest strategy is also the soundest strategy when combined with accurate intelligence and meticulous planning. Nimitz told Spruance, Turner, and Smith that they would attack Kwajalein immediately, that they would bypass the outer islands entirely, that they would commit the full strength of the American Pacific Fleet to the operation, and that they would do it in a way that would minimize American casualties by using overwhelming firepower and superior naval gunfire support, rather than relying on ground troops to fight their way through prepared defensive positions. The three commanders looked at each other in silence, because what Nimitz was ordering them to do violated every principle of conventional military doctrine and went against the advice of the three most experienced commanders in the Pacific. But they were professional officers, and Nimitz was the commanding admiral. So they saluted and they left the conference room to begin preparing for the assault on Kwajalein. The Japanese had fortified Kwajalein Atoll with over 8,000 soldiers and sailors under the command of Major General Akiyama Yoshimasa, who had prepared the island with elaborate defensive preparations, including concrete bunkers, interlocking fields of machine gun fire, artillery positions, beach obstacles, barbed wire, and defensive positions designed to make an American amphibious assault as difficult as possible. And Akiyama believed that the Americans would follow conventional doctrine by taking the outer islands first and building up logistical strength before attacking Kwajalein itself. The Japanese general was convinced that his defenses were strong enough to inflict such heavy casualties on any American assault that the Americans would be forced to call off the operation or accept losses that would be politically unacceptable to the American public. But what Akiyama did not understand was that Nimitz had developed a revolutionary new approach to amphibious warfare that would render many of the Japanese defenses completely obsolete by simply removing the ability of Japanese forces to defend themselves through superior naval gunfire support and overwhelming air superiority. On January 31, 1944, the American task force arrived off Kwajalein Atoll with 53,000 combat troops, 15 battleships, 6 heavy cruisers, 5 light cruisers, 34 destroyers, and nearly 500 carrier-based aircraft, representing the greatest concentration of naval firepower that the United States Navy had ever assembled for a single operation. And the firepower available to the American commanders was so overwhelming that it would give them the ability to destroy the Japanese defensive positions before ground troops ever set foot on the island. The American bombardment began before dawn on February 1, 1944, when battleships and cruisers opened fire on the Japanese positions on Kwajalein Island, and the naval guns poured thousands of tons of high-explosive shells onto the atoll in a continuous barrage that lasted for hours and that systematically destroyed the Japanese defensive positions, the bunkers, the artillery emplacements, the barbed wire, and the beach obstacles that Akiyama had spent months preparing. The preliminary bombardment was so effective and so destructive that when American troops landed on Kwajalein on February 1, 1944, they encountered very little organized resistance compared to what they had faced at Tarawa, because the Japanese defenders who had survived the bombardment were stunned and disoriented and unable to coordinate an effective defense against the American assault, and many of the defensive positions that the Japanese had prepared had been completely destroyed or rendered unusable by the American naval gunfire. The contrast with Tarawa was striking because at Tarawa, the preliminary bombardment had been limited due to poor planning and insufficient naval firepower, and Japanese defenders had survived in their concrete bunkers, protected by thick walls that American shells could not penetrate. But at Kwajalein, the American bombardment had been so intense and so comprehensive that it had devastated the Japanese positions and destroyed or killed most of the defenders before the assault even began. By February 4, 1944, just 3 days after the landings, American forces had secured Kwajalein Island and had killed nearly all of the Japanese defenders, with Japanese casualties totaling approximately 8,122 killed and only 372 prisoners captured, compared to American casualties of only 372 killed and 1,582 wounded, a casualty ratio that was the complete opposite of what military planners had predicted, and that proved Nimitz's strategy of overwhelming firepower and aggressive use of naval gunfire support had been absolutely correct. The American assault on Kwajalein had taken less than half the time of the Tarawa assault, had resulted in less than half the American casualties, despite attacking a much larger and more heavily fortified target, and had demonstrated that the Japanese were extremely vulnerable to American naval gunfire, and that the conventional wisdom about amphibious assault tactics needed to be completely revised based on what Nimitz had proven at Kwajalein. The implications of the Kwajalein victory were profound because it showed that the American Navy could use overwhelming firepower to dramatically reduce ground casualties, that careful planning and intelligence about Japanese defensive positions could give American commanders decisive advantages, and that sometimes the boldest and most unconventional strategy was actually the safest strategy when combined with superior technology and meticulous execution. Nimitz's decision to attack Kwajalein directly rather than taking the methodical approach that Spruance, Turner, and Smith had recommended resulted in American forces capturing a strategic position much faster than conventional military doctrine would have predicted, and it resulted in fewer American casualties than anyone had expected, which meant that American forces could move deeper into Japanese territory faster than the Japanese High Command believed was possible. But despite the overwhelming success of the Kwajalein operation, the battle quickly faded from popular memory and from the historical narrative of the Pacific War, because it did not conform to the pattern that Americans had come to expect from Pacific Island campaigns. Tarawa had been a nightmare of carnage and bloodshed, where Marines died by the thousands to capture a tiny atoll, and Americans remembered Tarawa because it was shocking and tragic and represented the kind of brutal grinding warfare that the Pacific had come to represent. But Kwajalein was a victory that went exactly right and that achieved its objectives with minimal casualties, which meant that it did not fit into the narrative of Pacific combat that Americans had become accustomed to. Military historians tended to focus on the battles that were difficult and costly and uncertain, because those battles told more dramatic stories and raised more interesting questions about leadership and strategy and sacrifice, while battles that went smoothly and were executed perfectly and resulted in minimal casualties seemed less important and less worthy of detailed historical study. The success of the Kwajalein operation also transformed American amphibious tactics for the remainder of the Pacific War, because Nimitz's demonstration that overwhelming naval gunfire support could dramatically reduce ground casualties became the standard approach for subsequent island assaults, and American commanders replicated Nimitz's strategy in later operations against islands like Saipan and Guam and the Philippines, where concentrated naval gunfire support was used to devastate Japanese defensive positions before ground troops assaulted. The Kwajalein operation proved that technological superiority and careful planning could minimize the cost of war in terms of human casualties, and it demonstrated that sometimes the most aggressive strategy is actually the most humane strategy, because it ends the fighting faster and results in fewer total casualties on both sides. For the Japanese, the defeat at Kwajalein was a catastrophic blow to their strategic situation in the Pacific, because they lost control of a major atoll that was vitally important for defending their territory, because they suffered massive casualties with almost no prisoners taken and almost no chance for survivors to bring back intelligence about American tactics and capabilities, and because the speed of the American victory meant that Japanese forces did not have time to reinforce Kwajalein or to prepare alternate defensive positions further west. The Japanese military leadership in Tokyo received reports of the disaster at Kwajalein and realized that their strategy of defending every island and inflicting heavy casualties on American forces was failing, and they began to understand that the American industrial capacity and technological superiority and ability to concentrate overwhelming firepower on single objectives made it impossible for Japanese forces to defend all of their far-flung territories against an enemy that could choose where and when to attack. Admiral Nimitz's decision to attack Kwajalein directly rather than following the advice of his three most experienced commanders demonstrated his confidence in his own judgment and his willingness to accept personal responsibility for a bold strategic decision that could have gone badly wrong, but which instead proved to be absolutely correct and which accelerated the American advance across the Pacific by months compared to what would have happened if conventional military doctrine had been followed. If Spruance, Turner, and Smith had been correct about the danger of attacking Kwajalein directly, the operation could have been a disaster that resulted in thousands of American casualties and that could have slowed the American advance significantly, but Nimitz's access to intelligence information about Japanese defensive positions and his understanding of the capabilities of American naval gunfire support and his confidence in the planning of his staff officers gave him the information he needed to make a decision that was bold but not reckless. The Battle of Kwajalein stands as a perfect example of how military victory achieved through superior planning and superior technology and overwhelming firepower can somehow become invisible to history when the victory goes exactly as planned and when casualties are minimized rather than maximized, because human beings remember stories of struggle and sacrifice and difficulty far better than they remember stories of triumph that came easily and that resulted in minimal loss of life. The battle that should have been one of the most celebrated victories in American military history became instead a footnote in the history of the Pacific War, remembered primarily by military historians and strategists who studied it as an example of successful amphibious assault tactics, but largely unknown to the general public and largely overlooked in popular accounts of the Pacific Campaign. The Kwajalein operation proved that Chester Nimitz was not just a competent military commander, but a visionary who understood that the future of warfare lay in the effective coordination of naval firepower, air power, and ground forces to achieve objectives with maximum efficiency and minimum casualties, and his willingness to override the advice of three extremely experienced commanders demonstrated the kind of independent judgment and confidence in his own analysis that separates truly great military leaders from merely competent ones. By February 4, 1944, when Kwajalein was secured and the American flag flew over the island, the Pacific War had entered a new phase where American forces could advance faster and inflict casualties on Japanese forces at ratios that were more favorable to the Americans, and where the possibility of eventual American victory had shifted from being a distant hope to being a mathematical certainty, all because one admiral was willing to trust his judgment and make a decision that contradicted the advice of his three most experienced commanders. The legacy of the Kwajalein operation extended far beyond the Pacific War itself, because it demonstrated principles of amphibious assault that would influence military planning for decades to come, and it proved that overwhelming firepower and meticulous planning could achieve military objectives while minimizing casualties in ways that conventional military wisdom had not anticipated. The battle also demonstrated that sometimes in military affairs, the boldest strategy is the one that is most likely to succeed when combined with superior technology and careful preparation, and that the willingness to question conventional wisdom and to trust in one's own analysis and in the capabilities of one's forces can lead to victory far more decisive than any amount of conventional caution could produce. If you enjoyed this video, hit the like button and subscribe for more history content covering wars, revolutions, and events that shaped the modern world.